In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this small succulent planter box. It has epoxy resin inlay and green chartreuse, some small walnut strips, and it's made out of red oak. Hopefully you can get some ideas and maybe make your own. Different size, different colors, things like that. It's a small succulent planter box. It measures about 8 inches long, about 4.5 inches tall, and about 1.5 to 2 inches wide. So come along and check out the project. So I wanted to give you a shot of where I'll be building the succulent planter box. I'm right in the middle of a project, a cyclone workbench. It's a dust collection system integrated. So I'll be working on a makeshift area on top of the bench and also on the bottom. The succulent box is actually a gift from my daughter. The succulent box is actually a pretty straightforward project, but I'll show you a couple hiccups I ran into later in the video. Again, I'm in the middle of a workbench project, a cyclone workbench. I'm literally cutting on my bandsaw underneath the workbench in a makeshift area. The dust collection system is active, it's just hooked up a little bit differently on the bandsaw. Right now I'm cutting the oak pieces for the side of the box. After I cut the red oak pieces to about 4 inches in diameter, now I'm ripping some walnut, and these walnut strips are going to be about 1/4 inch each a piece. That way we have a total dimension of 1/2 inch with the walnut and 4 inches with the red oak for a total of 4.5 inches for the height. So I was playing around with everything after I cut the pieces of wood, and I decided to cut a 1/4 inch strip of red oak as well to sandwich in between the walnut pieces. Then I also cut down the outside edge of the remaining red oak piece. So I'm laying everything out here is actually how I want it to look. Hopefully this gives you some ideas and some patterns that you can do of your own if you decide to make a succulent box. Now it's time for the glue up. And again, these succulent boxes are really easy to make. It really depends on how you want your corners. That is a little bit more time consuming, and I'll show you what I did with these corners coming up here in the video. I glued and clamped everything and let it set overnight. Now it's time to remove the clamps. After I glued up all the pieces and let it dry, I decided to actually cut down the box a little bit more. I didn't want the box quite that tall, so I went ahead and cut a little bit more off to shorten the height of the box. I wanted the box to have a recessed bottom so that when it sits on a counter or table or whatever, the whole entire bottom will not touch the table. So it's going to stand up just about 1/4 inch. So what I'm doing is routing a 1/4 inch rabbet groove in the bottom. Now I'm laying out and marking the epoxy resin inlay where the green chartreuse strip will be. I made a quick little jig with the start and stop points to route out the epoxy resin inlay sections. After I routed out the grooves for the epoxy resin, now comes the fun part. We're going to actually pour the epoxy resin inside those grooves. I've been mixing epoxy resin and adding chartreuse green color for a lot of my project lately, so I decided to go ahead and use the chartreuse green again for the accent strips for the succulent box. After I let the epoxy resin cure overnight, now it's time to go ahead and sand it flush with the rest of the surface. Now it's time to go ahead and cut the plank down into sections so we can assemble the sides. And I chose to use 45-degree bevel cuts for the edges. And as you can see, I'm using my cordless miter saw. And I mentioned earlier that I did run into some hiccups when I'm cutting the smaller pieces for the sides. It's very, very unsafe to go ahead and cut bevel cuts on pieces that small. There's no way to clamp it down, and it's very dangerous. So what I went ahead and did, I took some time off. I spent about 4 or 5 days. So what I did was I made a zero clearance miter saw table insert for my DeWalt cordless miter saw, so I can now safely cut the 45-degree angles on the smaller pieces for the succulent box. I'll have a video coming out next week on how I built this miter saw table hack, so be sure to subscribe so when I release the video you'll be notified to check it out. After I cut the pieces out on the miter saw, now it's time to go ahead and assemble the sides for the succulent box. Now I do this by laying out each piece in sequence on a piece of tape. Insert some glue into 45-degree bevel angles, and then fold up the box and clamp it together. After the sides of the succulent box have been assembled and the glue has dried, now it's time to go ahead and insert the bottom. After the sides are assembled and the bottom of the succulent box has been in place, now I decided to go ahead and put a thin layer of Danish oil on it just to give it a little bit of color and help protect the surface. You'll notice that while I'm applying a light layer of Danish oil to the succulent box, not only does it give it a light brown layer, but also add some vibrant color to the chartreuse epoxy inlay. The small succulent planter box has now been completed. If you're thinking about making your own succulent box, hopefully this gives you some ideas as far as the different patterns and colors and the things that you could do. Be sure to subscribe to follow my projects.